The sound that would haunt Margaret Whitmore for the rest of her life was not the creaking of the farmhouse or her brother-in-law's heartless laughter as he locked her in the room. As March's cold wind pierced through the world's thinnest shawl, the helpless cries of her youngest child rose, and the gravity of their situation had settled over them like a shroud. This emotional and chilling story takes place in the remote mountains of West Virginia in 1892. You will hear about the struggle for survival of a woman left alone with her children in those desolate mountains. The coal mines that covered these hills like black scars made some families rich, but unfortunately forced many women into widowhood. Margaret's husband, Thomas, had lost his life in a mine collapse 6 months earlier. During an early winter storm, the mine collapsed on top of him and 17 other men. The mining company paid Margaret $40 in compensation for this incident. This $40 was enough to bury Thomas with dignity, but it was too little to support a family of 7 for even a month. But before I tell you about the miracle Margaret found in that cursed cabin, I need you to understand just how desperate things had become. Picture a mother with 6 children ranging from 15-year-old Samuel down to 8-month-old Rose, standing in the snow with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a cloth bag containing their last heel of bread. Imagine knowing that your dead husband's family, the very people who should have protected you, had decided you were too expensive to keep around, because that's exactly where Margaret found herself. And what happened next would prove that sometimes the most terrifying places on earth hold the keys to salvation. The decision to cast them out hadn't been made in anger or haste. It had been calculated with the cold precision of men who saw human beings as ledger entries. Margaret's brother-in-law, Jeremiah Whitmore, who had inherited the family farm when Thomas died, and he'd spent the past 6 months making it clear that a widow and 6 extra mouths were liabilities he couldn't afford to carry. The conversation that sealed their fate had taken place 3 days earlier, in the parlor where Margaret had once felt welcome, where she'd nursed her babies and mended clothes by lamplight while Thomas worked his shifts in the mine. Margaret, Jeremiah had said, his voice carrying the tone of a man delivering a business decision rather than condemning his brother's family to probable death. You've got to understand our position here. Mary's expecting again. We've got our own 4 to worry about, and this farm can't support 12 people, especially not through another winter like the last one. Margaret had known this moment was coming. She'd seen it in the way Mary avoided her eyes at breakfast, in the way Jeremiah counted and recounted the supplies in the root cellar, in the increasingly pointed comments about the cost of keeping extra hands that couldn't contribute meaningfully to the farm's productivity. But knowing and experiencing were 2 different things, and the reality of being unwanted by the only family she had left hit her like a physical blow. Where would we go? She'd asked, though she already knew the answer. There was nowhere. The nearest town was 12 miles away down treacherous mountain roads, and even if they could make the journey, what waited for them there? She had no skills beyond those of farm wife and mother, no connections beyond this isolated community, no resources beyond her own desperate determination to keep her children alive. Jeremiah had cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet parlor. Well, there's the old Garrett place up on Widow's Peak. Been empty for, near on 100 years now. Cabin's still standing. Last I heard, roof might need some work, but it's shelter. Margaret had felt her blood turn to ice water. Everyone in these mountains knew about the Garrett place, though most folks preferred not to speak of it directly. It had been built by a family of herb gatherers and healers in the early 1800s, people who lived on the margins of the community and practiced what the local preacher called ungodly arts. The story went that they'd all died during the influenza outbreak of 1793, died horribly, according to local legend, cursing the land as they breathed their last. For a century since, no one had dared to settle there. Hunters occasionally reported strange sounds coming from the area, and more than one logger had claimed to see lights moving through the windows of the supposedly empty cabin. You can't mean to send us there, Margaret had whispered, her voice barely audible. That place it's not fit for decent Christian folk. It's a roof and 4 walls, Jeremiah had replied, his tone suggesting the matter was settled. More than most widows get when their husbands leave them with nothing but mouths to feed. I'll give you some supplies to get started, sack of flour, some salt pork, couple of blankets. But Margaret, I need you to understand, this is charity, not family obligation. I'm doing more than duty requires. The charity, as it turned out, consisted of the supplies he'd mentioned plus a rusty axe, a bag of dried beans that looked like they'd seen better decades, and a stern warning to make do with what Providence provides. He'd also given her a crude map drawn on the back of an envelope, showing the winding trail that led up to Widow's Peak in the isolated cabin that would either be their salvation or their tomb. The journey had taken them the better part of the day, climbing steadily upward along paths that seemed to have been forgotten by civilization itself. Samuel, her eldest, had carried baby Rose for long stretches while Margaret shouldered the heaviest pack and tried to keep the younger children moving despite their exhaustion and fear. 13-year-old Elizabeth had helped wrangle the middle children, 10-year-old Jacob, 8-year-old Mary, and 6-year-old David, while everyone tried to ignore the way the forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive the higher they climbed. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows that turned the surrounding woods into a maze of threatening shapes. Margaret's first glimpse of their new home nearly broke what was left of her resolve. The cabin was indeed still standing, but it looked like something that existed at the pleasure of the mountain itself, a structure so weathered and forgotten that it seemed to be melting back into the forest floor. The logs were gray with age and covered with moss. Several of the chinking stones had fallen out, leaving gaps that would let in wind and rain, and the roof sagged ominously in the middle, but it was the silence that truly unnerved her. The forest around the cabin was absolutely quiet, no bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, no normal sounds of woodland life. It was as if the very land around the Garrett place held its breath, waiting for something that had been postponed for a century. Ma, Samuel said quietly, his young voice already showing the strain of premature responsibility. Maybe we should go back. Maybe Uncle Jeremiah will. There is no going back, Margaret interrupted, her voice firmer than she felt. This is our home now, and we're going to make it work. She looked at the faces of her children, saw the fear and uncertainty there, and forced herself to project a confidence she didn't feel. It's just a cabin, just logs and stones and time. There's nothing here that can hurt us worse than starving in the snow. The interior of the cabin was a study in decades of abandonment. Dust lay thick on every surface, and spiderwebs draped the corners like funeral shrouds. A few pieces of furniture remained at a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs with rush seats that had mostly rotted away, a shelf built into one wall that held a few pottery vessels of indeterminate age. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney disappearing up into darkness. Most important, the structure was sound. The roof might sag, but it didn't leak. The walls might be drafty, but they blocked the worst of the wind. It was crude shelter, but it was shelter nonetheless. That first night, Margaret had built a fire in the ancient fireplace and gathered her children around it like a mother hen protecting her chicks. They'd eaten sparingly from their meager supplies and bedded down on the floor with their thin blankets, huddled together for warmth and comfort. The children had eventually succumbed to exhaustion, but Margaret had remained awake, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin, every whisper of wind through the chinks in the walls. It was during those long hours of the night that she'd first heard it, a sound from beneath the floorboards that was neither wood settling nor wind finding its way through cracks. It was a scraping, deliberate noise, as if something large was moving around in a space that shouldn't exist below the cabin. Margaret had initially dismissed it as imagination, born of stress and unfamiliar, but the sound had persisted, growing more pronounced as the night wore on. By morning, she'd convinced herself that it was nothing more than some woodland creature that had made its den beneath the cabin's foundation, a fox, perhaps, or a family of groundhogs. But the rational explanation felt thin even to her, and when she'd casually mentioned it to Samuel, she'd seen her own unease reflected in his young face. The second day had been devoted to making their shelter livable. Samuel had proven surprisingly handy with the rusty axe, chopping firewood and clearing away the worst of the debris that had accumulated around the cabin. Elizabeth had taken charge of cleaning the interior, sweeping away decades of dust and cobwebs with a broom improvised from birch twigs. The younger children had helped gather kindling and stack firewood, their natural energy gradually overcoming their initial fear of the place. But it was on the third night that their situation had become truly desperate. Baby Rose, who had been fussy and difficult to settle since their arrival, had developed a fever that seemed to burn right through her small body. Margaret had walked the floor with her all night, feeling the child's temperature rise despite everything she tried: cool cloths, skin-to-skin contact, even the few drops of whiskey Jeremiah had included in their supplies. By dawn, Rose was burning with fever and struggling to breathe, her small chest rising and falling with alarming rapidity. Margaret knew with horrible certainty that her baby was dying. She'd seen enough sickness in her life to recognize the signs, and she understood with crystal clarity that without medical attention that was impossible to obtain in their isolated location, Rose would be dead within days, possibly hours. The realization hit her like a physical blow, driving her to her knees beside the makeshift bed where her youngest child lay struggling for each breath. It was desperation that drove Margaret to examine the cabin more thoroughly than she had during their first 2 days of residence. She'd been so focused on basic survival, finding water, gathering firewood, making the place minimally livable, that she hadn't really looked at the details of their shelter. But now, with Rose's life hanging by a thread and nowhere else to turn, she found herself studying every corner of the single room that housed her family. The sound from beneath the floorboards had continued each night, and Margaret had begun to notice that it seemed to be centered beneath a particular section of the floor near the back wall. The boards in that area looked different, somehow older, more weathered, with wider gaps between them that seemed to let in a draft from below. More importantly, they didn't seem to be nailed down as securely as the rest of the flooring. Margaret, working quietly so as not to wake the children, had managed to remove the loose boards using her husband's old hunting knife. However, she couldn't believe her eyes when she discovered what was below, and it changed everything she knew about their situation. Hidden in the basement of the cabin was a root cellar she hadn't known existed. This wasn't just a simple storage area. It was a carefully constructed room, surrounded by shelves lined with stones and carved directly into the living rock. The space was dry and well preserved, clearly built to last centuries rather than decades, and it was filled with things that made Margaret's heart race with a mixture of hope and superstitious terror. Rows of glass jars lined the stone shelves, their contents preserved in ways Margaret didn't recognize but could somehow sense were still potent. Bundles of dried herbs hung from wooden pegs, their colors faded but their arrangement suggesting careful organization and purpose. Most intriguingly, there were books, not the kind of leather-bound volumes that might grace a gentleman's library, but handwritten journals bound in what looked like home-treated leather, filled with diagrams and notes in a script that was archaic but readable. Margaret had lifted one of the journals with trembling hands, opening it to reveal page after page of detailed illustrations of plants, accompanied by notes about their properties and uses. She'd recognized some of the plants immediately: willow bark for pain, chamomile chamomile for settling stomachs, echinacea for fighting infection. But there were others she'd never seen before, along with preparations and combinations that went far beyond the simple folk remedies she'd learned from her own mother. This wasn't just a collection of household remedies. This was a comprehensive library of herbal medicine, preserved for a century in the dry air of the hidden cellar. The Garrett family, it seemed, had been healers of considerable skill and knowledge, and they'd left behind everything they knew about the art of keeping people alive and healthy using nothing but what the mountains provided. With Rose's fever climbing higher and her own desperation reaching a crescendo, Margaret had found herself faced with an impossible choice. She could let her baby die while clinging to conventional wisdom and Christian propriety, or she could delve into knowledge that might be considered witchcraft by the very people who'd cast her out to die in the mountains. As she'd held her burning child and listened to the increasingly labored breathing, Margaret had realized that she didn't actually have a choice at all. If there was even a chance that the Garrett family's preserved knowledge could save Rose's life, she had to try it, regardless of the consequences to her soul or her reputation. Working by lamplight with desperate efficiency, Margaret had searched through the journals until she'd found what appeared to be treatments for fever in infants. The script was difficult to read in the flickering light, but she'd managed to decipher instructions for preparing a tincture using willow bark, elderflower, and something called fever root that grew, according to the detailed drawings, in damp areas near mountain streams. The fever root had been the challenge. Margaret had left her older children to watch the younger ones and baby Rose, and had ventured into the pre-dawn darkness with only her lamp for company, following the stream that ran past their cabin and searching for the distinctive three-lobed leaves depicted in the journal. She'd found it after nearly an hour of desperate searching, growing in the shade of a large boulder exactly as the ancient text had described. Back in the cabin, she'd prepared the tincture according to the journal's instructions, boiling water over their fire and steeping the herbs in proportions that had been carefully measured and recorded by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. The resulting liquid had been bitter and aromatic, smelling of forest depths and ancient knowledge. Giving it to Rose had required an act of faith that went against everything Margaret had been taught about proper medicine and Christian healing. But as she dropped the precious liquid onto her baby's tongue and watched those tiny lips respond instinctively to the bitter taste, she'd understood that sometimes salvation came wearing the mask of damnation, and wisdom could be found in the most unexpected places. The improvement had been gradual at first. Rose's breathing seemed to ease slightly, and the deadly heat that had been radiating from her small body began to diminish. But by the next morning, the change was undeniable. The fever had broken completely. Rose was nursing eagerly, and the child who had been dying in Margaret's arms just hours before was looking around with bright, alert eyes. Margaret had stared at her healthy baby and then at the journal that had provided the cure, understanding that she'd stumbled onto something that went far beyond simple folk remedies. The Garrett family's knowledge wasn't just comprehensive, it was effective in ways that challenged everything she thought she knew about medicine and healing. As she'd sat in the morning light, holding her recovered child and surrounded by the journals and preserved medicines that had saved Rose's life, Margaret Whitmore had realized that being cast out to the cursed cabin on Widow's Peak hadn't been the disaster she'd feared. It had been the beginning of a transformation that would change not only her own life, but the lives of everyone in these isolated mountain communities who had given up hope of finding healing for their ailments. The widow who'd been expelled to die in the mountains was about to become the most powerful woman in 3 counties, armed with knowledge that had been waiting a century for the right person to claim it. The transformation that began with Rose's miraculous recovery from fever spread through Margaret's understanding of her situation like ripples across still water. What had seemed like exile to a cursed place now revealed itself as something else entirely, an inheritance of knowledge that had been waiting for someone desperate enough to claim it and skilled enough to use it. Over the following weeks, a spring fought its way up the mountainside and the forest around their cabin slowly came alive. Margaret dove deeper into the Garrett family's preserved wisdom with the intensity of a woman who had discovered that survival and mastery were often the same thing. The hidden cellar beneath their cabin proved to be far more extensive than Margaret had initially realized. What she'd first taken for a simple root cellar was actually a complex of interconnected chambers carved directly into the mountain's bedrock, each room serving a specific purpose in what had clearly been a sophisticated medical practice. One chamber was devoted entirely to the storage of dried herbs, with wooden shelves that extended from floor to ceiling and small drawers labeled in the same archaic script that filled the journals. Another room housed what appeared to be a primitive but effective distillation apparatus, with copper tubing and glass vessels that suggested the Garretts had been capable of producing medicines far more complex than simple herb teas. But it was the third chamber that truly took Margaret's breath away. This room was clearly the heart of the operation, a study and laboratory where the actual work of healing had been planned and executed. The walls were lined with more journals than Margaret had ever seen in one place, each one focused on a different aspect of herbal medicine. There were volumes devoted to respiratory ailments, digestive disorders, wounds and infections, women's health, and even what appeared to be surgical procedures that could be performed with plant-based anesthetics and antiseptics. Most remarkably, everything was preserved in perfect condition. The dry mountain air and stone construction had protected the Garrett family's library from decay, leaving behind a resource that was more comprehensive than anything Margaret could have imagined. These weren't simple folk remedies passed down through oral tradition. This was systematic medical knowledge, carefully observed and recorded by people who had devoted their lives to understanding how the human body worked and how the plants of these mountains could be used to heal. Margaret's education in this new world began with necessity and grew into fascination, with Rose's recovery serving as proof that the old knowledge could indeed save lives. She threw herself into studying the journals with an intensity that surprised even her. Working by lamplight after her children were asleep, she slowly made her way through volume after volume, learning not just which plants to use for specific conditions, but why they worked, how they should be prepared, and what combinations were most effective for complex ailments. The children, initially wary of their mother's nocturnal activities in the mysterious cellar, gradually became her assistants and students. Samuel, with his natural intelligence and growing strength, proved particularly adept at identifying and gathering the plants illustrated in the journals. Elizabeth, who had always shown a talent for organization and detail, that became the keeper of the herbal inventory, carefully cataloging what they had and what they needed to gather during different seasons. Even the younger children found roles in what was becoming the mountain's only functioning medical practice. Jacob, despite his youth, had an uncanny ability to remember where specific plants grew and when they should be harvested. Little Mary showed remarkable gentleness in handling the delicate processes of drying and storing herbs, while David's sharp eyes made him an excellent scout for finding new specimens in the surrounding forest. As Margaret's knowledge expanded, so did her confidence in using it. When Elizabeth came down with a persistent cough that threatened to develop into something more serious, Margaret prepared a syrup using wild cherry bark, pine needle oil, and honey that cleared the condition within days. When Samuel cut his hand badly on a sharp stone, she cleaned the wound with a tincture made from golden seal and echin, then applied a poultice that promoted healing without infection. Word of these successes, small as they were within the context of her own family, began to spread through the mountain communities in ways Margaret hadn't expected. The mountains might have been sparsely populated, but they weren't uninhabited, and news traveled along the network of hunters, trappers, and isolated homesteaders who made their living in these remote areas. The first outsider to seek Margaret's help was a grizzled trapper named Josiah Creek, who appeared at their cabin door one morning with his arm wrapped in a blood-soaked rag and desperation written across his weather-beaten face. He'd been working his trap lines when a wounded bear had surprised him, opening 3 deep gashes from his elbow to his wrist that were already showing signs of serious infection. "Heard tell you might know something about healing," he'd said, his voice tight with pain and the kind of embarrassment that came from admitting weakness. "Doc Henderson down in the valley is 3 days' ride, and I ain't sure I got 3 days left in me." Margaret had looked at the wounded arm and felt the familiar surge of desperate determination that she'd come to associate with her new calling. The injuries were serious, deep enough to expose muscle and bone, infected enough that red streaks were already climbing toward the man's shoulder. In the old world, before the Garrett journals, she would have been able to do nothing but offer sympathy and perhaps a prayer. Now she found herself mentally reviewing everything she'd learned about wound care and infection control, working with steady hands and growing confidence. Margaret had cleaned Josiah's wounds with a solution of golden seal yarrow, an alcohol distilled from wild berries according to a recipe she'd found in one of the surgical journals. The cleaning process had been agonizing for the patient, but it had removed the infected tissue and foreign matter that was poisoning his system. Next, she'd applied a poultice made from plantain, comfrey, and a dozen other healing plants, binding the wounds with clean cloths and giving Josiah strict instructions about keeping the dressings changed and the arm elevated. The treatment had worked better than even Margaret had dared to hope. Within a week, the infection was clearly retreating, and within 2 weeks, the wounds were healing cleanly with minimal scarring. Josiah Creek had become Margaret's first evangelical convert, spreading word throughout his network of mountain men and isolated settlers that the witch woman on Widow's Peak could heal injuries that would normally mean death or permanent disability. But it was the case of little Anna Whitfield that truly established Margaret's reputation and changed her from a desperate mother trying to save her own children into someone the entire mountain community would come to depend on. Anna was the 7-year-old daughter of a homesteading family who lived about 8 miles east of Margaret's cabin, and she'd been suffering from what her mother described as the wasting sickness, a condition that had left her barely able to walk and growing thinner by the day despite eating normally. When Anna's parents brought her to the cabin, Margaret had taken one look at the pale, listless child and immediately suspected what the Garrett journals called the iron hunger, a condition that seemed to affect women and children disproportionately and could be fatal if left untreated. According to the journals, the condition was caused by the body's inability to properly absorb iron from food, leading to a gradual weakening that could mimic consumption or other wasting diseases. The treatment described in the journals was complex, involving not just herbal medicines but specific dietary changes and what appeared to be an early form of nutritional therapy. Margaret had prepared a tonic using yellow dockroot nettle and blackstrap molasses ingredients that the journals claimed would help the body absorb and utilize iron more effectively. She'd also given Anna's parents detailed instructions about foods that would help or hinder the healing process. The improvement had been dramatic. Within 2 weeks, Anna's color had returned, and she was beginning to gain weight. Within a month, she was running and playing like any healthy child. The transformation was so striking that Anna's parents began bringing other families to see Margaret, and soon there was a steady stream of people climbing the mountain mountain path to the witchwoman's cabin. Margaret found herself treating everything from difficult births to mysterious fevers, from chronic pain to injuries that should have left people permanently disabled. The Garrett journals seemed to contain solutions for conditions that the valley's few doctors dismissed as incurable, and Margaret's success rate was high enough that even the most skeptical mountain folk had to admit that something remarkable was happening on Widow's Peak. But with growing reputation came growing scrutiny, and not all of it was welcome. The local preacher, Reverend Blackwood, had begun delivering increasingly pointed sermons about the dangers of consorting with witches and the importance of trusting in divine providence rather than ungodly arts. Several of the more prominent families in the valley had let it be known that they considered Margaret's activities to be not just questionable but spiritual dangerous. Margaret was aware of the growing opposition to her work, but she was also aware that the opposition came primarily from people who had never needed her services: the families who brought their sick children to her cabin, the men who climbed the mountain with infected wounds, the women who sought her help with difficult pregnancies. These people didn't care about theological debates, they cared about results, and Margaret's results spoke for themselves. The situation came to a head when Reverend Blackwood himself appeared at Margaret's cabin door, accompanied by 2 deacons and wearing an expression of righteous determination that made her blood run cold. She'd been expecting this confrontation for weeks, and she'd prepared for it as carefully as she prepared her medicines. "Mrs. Whitmore," the Reverend had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I've come to discuss your activities here. There are concerns in the community about the nature of your healing practices, and I feel it's my duty to address these concerns directly." Margaret had stood in her doorway, very aware of her children watching from behind her and equally aware of the dozens of glass jars and herbal preparations visible on the shelves behind her. She'd understood that this moment would determine whether she could continue her work or would be forced to abandon it under pressure from the religious authorities. "Reverend," she'd replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, "I appreciate your concern for my spiritual welfare, but I wonder if you'd be equally concerned if I were letting people die rather than trying to save them." The challenge had been carefully calculated. Margaret had learned from the Garrett journals that the key to dealing with religious opposition wasn't to deny the effectiveness of her methods, but to frame them in terms that even the most conservative Christians would find difficult to argue against. After all, what kind of minister could openly oppose saving lives? "Mrs. Whitmore," Reverend Blackwood had continued, his tone growing sharper, "healing is the Lord's province, not man's. When we presume to take such matters into our own hands using methods that are questionable in their origins, we risk not only our own souls but the souls of those we claim to help." "With respect," Reverend Margaret had replied, "I don't presume to heal anyone. I simply use the knowledge God has provided through His creation to help people who are suffering. Every plant I use, every remedy I prepare, comes from the natural world that Scripture tells us was made for our benefit." It was a theological argument she'd prepared carefully, drawing on biblical passages about the earth yielding its treasures for human use and the responsibility of Christians to care for the sick and suffering. More importantly, it was an argument that put the Reverend in the position of opposing not just her methods, but the very idea of using God's creation for healing purposes. The confrontation had continued for nearly an hour, with Reverend Blackwood becoming increasingly frustrated as Margaret deflected his theological challenges and redirected the conversation toward the practical results of her work. She'd invited him to speak with the families she'd helped, to examine the children who were alive because of her interventions, to consider whether a God of love would truly condemn knowledge that saved lives. In the end, the Reverend had left without securing the promise he'd come for that Margaret would abandon her healing practice and return to conventional Christian submission. But he'd also left with a clear understanding that Margaret wasn't going to be intimidated or shamed into giving up work that she considered to be both morally justified and desperately needed by her community. The confrontation had established an uneasy truce between Margaret and the religious establishment, but it had also clarified something important about her own transformation. She was no longer the desperate widow who'd been cast out to die in the mountains. She'd become someone with power, knowledge, and purpose, someone who could stand up to authority figures and defend her choices with conviction and skill. As spring turned to summer and her reputation continued to grow, Margaret began to understand that her exile to the cursed cabin had given her something that no amount of charity or family support could have provided: independence. She wasn't dependent on anyone's goodwill or approval for her survival. She had knowledge, she had skills, and she had the growing respect of people who valued results over rhetoric. The widow who'd been expelled for being a burden had become the most valuable person in 3 counties, and she was just beginning to understand the full scope of what that transformation would mean for her and her children. Chapter 3. The summer of 1892 brought changes to Widow's Peak that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, when Margaret and her children had first climbed the mountain path as refugees with nowhere else to turn. What had begun as desperate exile had transformed into something approaching prosperity, though it was a prosperity built on knowledge rather than gold, and respect earned through results rather than inherited through family connections. The cabin that had once seemed like a tomb waiting to claim their lives had become the beating heart of a medical practice that served families scattered across hundreds of square miles of rugged mountain terrain. Margaret's days now followed a rhythm that would have been unimaginable during her previous life as a miner's wife. She rose before dawn to check on patients who had stayed overnight, for the cabin had evolved into something approaching a primitive hospital, with pallets cots laid out in the main room for people too sick to make the journey back to their homes immediately after treatment. After tending to these patients and preparing their morning medications, she would spend time in the underground chambers, consulting the Garrett journals and preparing the various tinctures, poultices, and herbal preparations that had become her stock in trade. The complexity of her work had grown exponentially as her understanding of the Garrett family's methods deepened. What had started with simple fever treatments and wound care had evolved into sophisticated therapeutic interventions that addressed chronic conditions, mental ailments, and complex medical problems that the valley's few trained doctors either couldn't or wouldn't attempt to treat. Margaret found herself dealing with everything from difficult pregnancies to mysterious wasting diseases, from broken bones that needed to be set properly to infections that threatened to turn into life-threatening sepsis. Her children had become integral parts of the operation, each one developing specialized skills that contributed to the overall success of their unconventional medical practice. Samuel, now 16 and growing into the kind of young man who commanded respect from adults twice his age, had become Margaret's chief assistant in the more demanding aspects of patient care. He could set broken bones with steady hands, assist with the minor surgical procedures that Margaret had learned from the Garrett journals, and manage the physical demands of caring for seriously ill patients who needed constant attention. Elizabeth, at 14, had developed an almost supernatural ability to organize and manage the complex inventory of herbs, preparations, and medical supplies that their practice required. She maintained detailed records of what plants needed to be gathered during which seasons, which preparations were running low and needed to be replaced, and which patients were due for follow-up treatments. More importantly, she had begun to show real aptitude for diagnosis, often noticing symptoms and patterns that helped Margaret identify underlying conditions. The younger children had found their own niches within the expanding operation. Jacob, despite being only 11, had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of where specific plants grew throughout the mountain region. He could lead expeditions to gather rare herbs with the confidence of an experienced woodsman, and his sharp memory meant that he rarely forgot the location of a particularly productive patch of medicinal plants. Mary and David, though still quite young, had proven remarkably adept at the careful work of preparing dried herbs and maintaining the various preparations that needed to be stirred, filtered, or monitored on a daily basis. Even baby Rose, now a healthy and energetic toddler, had become a kind of mascot for the practice. Patients often commented on how remarkable it was to see the child who had been saved by Margaret's intervention during those first desperate weeks, and Rose's obvious health and vitality served as a living advertisement for the effectiveness of Margaret's methods. But the transformation of the Whitmore family went beyond their individual roles in the medical practice. They had evolved from desperate refugees into something approaching mountain aristocracy. Though their status was based on knowledge and service rather than land ownership or inherited wealth, people traveled for days to consult with Margaret, bringing not only their ailments but also gifts and payments that had gradually transformed the family's financial situation from desperate poverty to relative comfort. The payments came in many forms, reflecting the barter economy that prevailed in the isolated mountain communities. Families brought livestock, chickens, goats, even the occasional cow or pig in exchange for medical treatment. Others offered crafted goods, furniture, tools, clothing, and household items that gradually transformed the Spartan cabin into a comfortable home. Some patients paid with labor, helping to expand and improve the cabin, clear additional land for growing medicinal plants, and maintain the increasingly complex infrastructure that supported Margaret's practice. Most significantly, several families had begun sending their older children to work with Margaret as apprentices, recognizing that the knowledge she possessed was valuable enough to justify placing their sons and daughters in her service for months or even years at a time. These apprentices not only provided additional labor for the demanding work of gathering, preparing, and administering herbal medicines, but they also represented Margaret's efforts to ensure that the Garrett family's knowledge wouldn't be lost again when she was no longer able to practice. The physical expansion of the operation had been as dramatic as its intellectual growth. The original cabin had been extended with additional rooms that served as patient wards, consultation areas, and storage spaces for the ever-growing inventory of medical supplies. A separate building had been constructed to house the more dangerous or odorous aspects of herbal preparation, the distillation of alcohol-based tinctures, the rendering of animal fats for medicinal salve, and the preparation of the stronger medicines that required careful handling and controlled access. Most impressively, Margaret had supervised the construction of a greenhouse using techniques she'd found described in one of the Garrett journals. This structure, built with a framework of mountain laurel and panels of oiled cloth that let in light while protecting against frost, allowed her to grow medicinal plants year-round and experiment with cultivating species that didn't naturally occur in the mountain environment. The greenhouse had become a kind of the laboratory where Margaret tested new combinations of plants and developed improved versions of traditional remedies. The underground chambers beneath the original cabin had also been expanded, with new rooms carved into the mountain's bedrock to accommodate the growing collection of preserved medicines and the increasingly sophisticated equipment that Margaret had either acquired through trade or manufactured using techniques described in the Garrett journals. One chamber now housed a complete distillation apparatus that allowed Margaret to produce high-proof alcohol for tinctures and antiseptics. Another room had been converted into a surgical suite of sorts, with stone tables that could be thoroughly cleaned and oil lamps positioned to provide optimal lighting for the minor operations that Margaret had learned to perform. Perhaps the most significant expansion had been in Margaret's network of contacts and collaborators throughout the mountain region. What had started as isolated families seeking help for specific medical problems had evolved into a loose confederation of communities that relied on Margaret not just for medical treatment, but for coordination of health-related information and resources. Margaret had begun training selected individuals in each community to serve as local health assistants, teaching them to recognize common conditions, prepare basic remedies, and identify situations that required her direct intervention. These assistants formed a communication network that allowed Margaret to track the spread of infectious diseases, coordinate responses to medical emergencies, and ensure that her services were available to people who couldn't make the difficult journey to Widow's Peak. The success of this network had become apparent during the summer's first major medical crisis, an outbreak of what appeared to be diphtheria in a remote settlement about 20 miles north of Margaret's cabin. Traditional medical wisdom would have suggested quarantine and prayer as the only available responses, but Margaret had developed a different approach based on her study of the Garrett journals and her growing understanding of how diseases spread and could be controlled. Working with her network of local assistants, Margaret had been able to identify the outbreak in its early stages and coordinate a response that combined quarantine procedures with aggressive treatment using herbal medicines, specifically chosen for their antibacterial and immune system supporting properties. She had prepared large quantities of echinacea and golden seal tincture, along with throat sprays made from sage and myrrh, and had distributed these medicines throughout the affected community, along with detailed instructions for their use. The results had been remarkable. While diphtheria outbreaks in other mountain communities typically claimed the lives of half or more of those infected, particularly children and elderly people, Margaret's intervention had reduced the mortality rate to less than 10%. Word of this success had spread throughout the region, cementing Margaret's reputation as someone who could achieve medical results that went far beyond anything the conventional medical establishment could provide. However, this growing success had also attracted increasingly serious opposition from established authorities who saw Margaret's practice as a challenge to their own power and legitimacy. The local medical establishment, represented primarily by Dr. Harrison Caldwell, the valley's only formally trained physician, had begun to organize systematic opposition to what he termed the dangerous quackery being practiced by untrained individuals on Widow's Peak. Dr. Caldwell was a man of considerable education and social standing, having trained at a prestigious Eastern medical college before returning to establish his practice in what he considered the benighted mountain region. He viewed Margaret's success as a personal affront to his professional qualifications and a dangerous precedent that could undermine public confidence in legitimate medical practice. More practically, Margaret's growing reputation was cutting into his own patient base, as families who had once traveled to the valley for medical care were now making the climb to Widow's Peak instead. The conflict between Margaret and Dr. Caldwell came to a head during what became known as the Sutton case, a medical emergency that tested not only Margaret's skills, but also her ability to defend her methods against professional medical opposition. The case involved Martha Sutton, a young mother who had developed serious complications following the birth of her third child. The conventional medical response, as prescribed by Dr. Caldwell, that had involved bloodletting and mercury-based treatments that had left Martha near death despite weeks of expensive care. When Martha's husband had finally brought her to Margaret in desperation, she had been barely conscious and showing signs of mercury poisoning in addition to the original postpartum complications. Margaret's examination, guided by diagnostic techniques she'd learned from the Garrett journals, had revealed that Martha was suffering from what the old texts called childbed fever, an infection of the reproductive system that could be fatal if not treated properly, but which responded well to specific herbal treatments when administered correctly. Working around the clock for 3 days, Margaret had used a combination of internal medicines and external treatments to address both the mercury poisoning and the underlying infection. She had administered activated charcoal to bind the mercury in Martha's system, used liver-supporting herbs to help process the toxins, and applied antiseptic washes and healing poultices to address the infected tissues. Most controversially, she had also used techniques from the Garrett surgical journals to remove infected tissue that conventional treatment had failed to address. The treatment had been successful beyond anyone's expectations. Within a week, Martha was conscious and alert. Within 2 weeks, she was strong enough to care for her infant son. Within a month, she had made a complete recovery and was healthier than she had been before her pregnancy began. The dramatic nature of her recovery, particularly following the failure of conventional medical treatment, had created a sensation throughout the region and had established Margaret's reputation as someone who could succeed where trained physicians failed. But Dr. Caldwell's response to the Sutton case had been swift and aggressive. Rather than acknowledging the effectiveness of Margaret's treatment, he had filed formal complaints with both civil and religious authorities, arguing that Margaret was practicing medicine without proper training or licensing, and that her methods were both dangerous and potentially criminal. He had also begun a campaign to discredit Margaret's work by spreading rumors about the witchcraft and devil worship that he claimed were the real sources of her apparent success. The accusations had forced Margaret to defend not only her medical methods but also her character and spiritual standing within the community. The confrontation had culminated in what amounted to a public medical debate held in the valley's largest church and attended by representatives from throughout the mountain region. Margaret had been called upon to explain and justify her methods in front of an audience that included not only Dr. Caldwell and various religious authorities, but also many of the families whose lives had been saved by her interventions. The debate had been a pivotal moment in Margaret's transformation from desperate exile to regional medical authority. Standing before the assembled crowd, she had presented a detailed explanation of her methods that drew on both scientific principles and biblical justifications for using natural remedies to heal the sick. She had brought with her several of the Garrett journals, demonstrating the careful observation and systematic documentation that had gone into developing the treatments she used. Most importantly, she had invited the families she had helped to testify about their experiences and the results they had achieved through her care. The testimony had been overwhelming in its support for Margaret's work. Family after family had stood to describe how Margaret's interventions had saved lives, cured chronic conditions, and provided relief from suffering that conventional medicine had been unable to address. Children who had been dying from mysterious illnesses were present and healthy. Adults who had been crippled by injuries or chronic conditions were walking and working normally. The evidence was not theoretical or abstract, it was living, breathing proof that Margaret's methods worked. Dr. Caldwell's response had been to argue that such results were either coincidental or temporary, and that the long-term consequences of Margaret's unscientific methods would eventually become apparent. He had also continued to emphasize the dangers of allowing untrained individuals to practice medicine, arguing that even successful treatments were dangerous if they encouraged people to avoid proper medical care. But the audience's reaction had made it clear that the community's loyalty lay with results rather than credentials. When the formal presentations were finished and the question of Margaret's future practice was put to a community vote, the result had been overwhelmingly in her favor. Not only were the assembled families unwilling to condemn Margaret's work, but many of them had spoken passionately about their determination to continue seeking her help regardless of official opposition. The victory had been more than just a personal triumph for Margaret. It had established a precedent that would protect her practice and legitimize her methods in the eyes of the broader community. She had proven that knowledge and results could trump formal credentials, and that ordinary people were capable of making informed decisions about their medical care when presented with clear evidence about the effectiveness of different approaches. As summer turned toward fall and the one anniversary of her family's arrival on Widow's Peak approached, Margaret found herself reflecting on the extraordinary transformation that had taken place. The desperate widow who had been cast out to die in the mountains had become the region's most respected medical practitioner. Her children, who had faced starvation and exposure, were now healthy, educated, and possessed of valuable skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Most importantly, the knowledge that had been hidden beneath the cabin floor for nearly a century was now being shared, taught, and preserved for future generations. Margaret had not only saved her own family, she had rescued an entire tradition of healing that might otherwise have been lost forever. Widow's Exile had become the foundation of a medical dynasty that would serve the mountain communities for generations to come. The winter of 1893 arrived early in the mountains, bringing with it challenges that would test everything Margaret had learned about survival, medicine, and leadership during her first transformative year on Widow's Peak. By October, snow was already dusting the higher elevations, and the network of patients and apprentices that had developed around Margaret's practice faced the struggle of maintaining connections across terrain that could become impassable for weeks or even months at a time. But this winter would be different from any that the mountain communities had experienced before, because now they had Margaret's knowledge and organizational skills to help them prepare for the hardships ahead. The preparation for winter had begun in late summer, as Margaret worked with her network of local assistants to ensure that each community had adequate supplies of essential medicines to last through the months when travel to Widow's Peak would be impossible. Using techniques she'd learned from the Garrett journals, she had trained dozens of people throughout the region in the basic skills of herbal preparation and preservation, creating a distributed system of medical care that could function even when the central hub was cut off by weather. The process had been exhausting but exhilarating, as Margaret traveled from community to community conducting intensive training sessions that covered everything from basic diagnosis and treatment to the complex art of preparing tinctures and concentrated medicines. She had taught mothers how to recognize and treat childhood diseases, shown fathers how to set broken bones and treat injuries, and provided community leaders with detailed protocols for dealing with medical emergencies when professional help was days or weeks away. But even as she worked to prepare the mountain communities for winter, Margaret was also dealing with increasingly complex medical cases that challenged her growing expertise and forced her to delve deeper into the most advanced sections of the Garrett journals. The reputation she had earned through her success with common ailments and straightforward injuries had begun to attract patients with conditions that conventional medicine considered hopeless: chronic diseases, mysterious symptoms, and cases that had stumped trained physicians. One of the most challenging cases of this period involved a young man named Jonathan Pierce, who had been brought to Margaret by his desperate family after months of progressive paralysis that had begun in his legs and was slowly working its way up his body. Dr. Caldwell had diagnosed the condition as an incurable degenerative disease and had essentially told the family to prepare for Jonathan's inevitable death. The young man, who had been a robust logger before his illness began, was now unable to walk and was beginning to lose the use of his hands. Margaret's examination examination of Jonathan, guided by diagnostic techniques she'd found in one of the more advanced Garrett journals, had revealed symptoms that suggested something quite different from an incurable degenerative condition. The pattern of paralysis, combined with certain other signs that conventional medicine had overlooked, pointed to what the old texts described as the metal sickness, a condition caused by gradual poisoning from exposure to certain minerals or industrial compounds. The discovery had led Margaret to investigate Jonathan's work history in detail, and she had learned that he had spent the previous year working in a mine where a new extraction process using mercury and lead compounds had recently been introduced. The symptoms he was experiencing were consistent with chronic heavy metal poisoning, a condition that the Garrett journals suggested could be treated using specific detoxification protocols that combined herbal medicines with dietary modifications and what the old texts called purification procedures. The treatment had been complex and demanding, requiring Jonathan to remain at the cabin for several weeks while Margaret administered a carefully orchestrated combination of medicines designed to bind the toxic metals in his system and help his body eliminate them safely. The process had involved daily doses of herbs like cilantro and chlorella that the journals claimed could capture heavy metals, along with liver-supporting compounds that would help process and eliminate the toxins. More challenging had been the purification procedures described in the journal's techniques that included controlled sweating sessions, special baths using mineral-rich mountain spring water, and dietary protocols that seemed designed to give the body's natural detoxification systems the best possible chance to function effectively. Margaret had also used some of the more esoteric techniques described in the journals, including the application of specific mineral poultices to certain areas of Jonathan's body and the administration of tinctures prepared according to complex timing schedules that seemed to be based on lunar cycles and seasonal changes. The treatment had worked slowly but steadily. After 2 weeks, Jonathan had begun to regain some sensation in his legs. After a month, he could move his toes and flex his ankles. After 2 months, he was walking with assistance, and after 3 months, he had made what appeared to be a complete recovery. The success had been so dramatic that word of it had spread throughout the region, attracting even more patients with supposedly incurable conditions and cementing Margaret's reputation as someone who could achieve medical miracles. But the Jonathan Pierce case had also attracted renewed attention from Dr. Caldwell and other members of the established medical community, who argued that such dramatic recoveries were impossible and that Margaret must be either deceiving people about her results or using dangerous methods that would eventually cause more harm than good. The controversy had escalated when Dr. Caldwell had demanded the right to examine Jonathan Pierce himself, claiming that he needed to verify that the recovery was genuine and that no long-term damage had been done by Margaret's unscientific treatments. The examination had taken place in a tense atmosphere, with representatives from both the conventional medical establishment and Margaret's supporters present to witness the proceedings. Dr. Caldwell had conducted a thorough physical examination of Jonathan Pierce, testing his reflexes, muscle strength, coordination, and cognitive function. To his obvious frustration, he had been forced to admit that Jonathan appeared to be in excellent health and showed no signs of the degenerative condition that had originally been diagnosed. However, rather than acknowledging the effectiveness of Margaret's treatment, Dr. Caldwell had argued that the original diagnosis must have been incorrect and that Jonathan had never actually been suffering from the serious condition that his family had described. This explanation had been met with outrage from Jonathan's family and other witnesses who had seen the progression of his illness and his dramatic recovery, but it had allowed Dr. Caldwell to maintain his position that conventional medical training was superior to Margaret's methods. Controversy had highlighted one of the ongoing challenges that Margaret faced in establishing legitimacy for her work: the medical establishments, the refusal to acknowledge results that contradicted their understanding of what was possible. Rather than investigating Margaret's methods to understand how she was achieving her successes, conventional physicians seemed determined to deny that the successes were occurring at all. But while the medical establishment remained hostile, Margaret's support among the ordinary families of the mountain region continued to grow stronger. The winter of 1893 provided a crucial test of the distributed medical system she had worked to establish, as severe weather cut off many communities from outside contact for months at a time. During this period, the local assistants that Margaret had trained were forced to handle medical emergencies using only the knowledge and supplies she had provided. The results exceeded even Margaret's optimistic expectations. Despite being isolated from professional medical care for extended periods, the mountain communities experienced significantly fewer medical crises and deaths than had been typical in previous winters. The combination of preventive care techniques that Margaret had taught and the availability of effective herbal treatments for common winter ailments had dramatically improved the overall health and survival rates throughout the region. More importantly, several of Margaret's most advanced apprentices had successfully handled complex medical cases that would normally have required her direct intervention. Elizabeth Whitmore, now 15 and Margaret's most skilled assistant, who had successfully delivered 3 babies during the winter months, using techniques she had learned from the obstetrical sections of the Garrett journals. Samuel had set broken bones and treated serious injuries with results that matched anything Margaret herself could have achieved. The success of the distributed wood system during the winter months had proven that Margaret's knowledge could be effectively transferred to others and that the medical improvements she had brought to the region were sustainable rather than dependent on her personal involvement in every case. This realization had profound profound implications for the future of medical care in the mountain communities and had convinced Margaret that they needed to formalize and expand her training programs. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Margaret had begun developing what she privately thought of as a mountain medical college, a systematic program for training healers who could serve communities throughout the region using the knowledge preserved in the Garrett journals. The program would combine theoretical instruction in diagnosis and treatment with hands-on training in herbal medicine preparation and patient care techniques. The first formal class of the Mountain Medical College had begun in April 1893, with 12 students ranging in age from 16 to 40 and representing communities scattered across hundreds of miles of mountain territory. The students lived at the expanded cabin complex on Widow's Peak, studying during the day and assisting with patient care in the evenings. The curriculum covered everything from basic anatomy and physiology to advanced herbal pharmacology and surgical techniques. Margaret had structured the program to last 2 full years, with students spending the first year learning fundamental concepts and basic skills, and the second year specializing in particular areas of medical practice, based on their interests and the needs of their home communities. Some students focused on obstetrics and women's health, but others on injury treatment and emergency medicine, and still others on the treatment of chronic conditions and complex diseases. The establishment of the formal training program had represented another significant milestone in Margaret's transformation. From desperate exile to regional medical authority, she was no longer just treating individual patients or even coordinating care across multiple communities. She was creating an educational institution that would preserve and transmit the Garrett family's knowledge to future generations of healers. But the expansion of Margaret's activities had also attracted the attention of authorities beyond the local medical and religious establishments. State officials had begun to take notice of reports about the unlicensed medical practice being conducted on Widow's Peak, and there were rumors that formal legal action might be taken to shut down Margaret's operations and prosecute her for practicing medicine without proper credentials. The threat of legal intervention had forced Margaret to consider the political dimensions of her work in ways that she had previously avoided. The knowledge contained in the Garrett journals was undeniably effective, but its effectiveness didn't automatically confer legal protection for people who used it. Margaret realized that she needed to develop strategies for protecting not only her own practice but also the network of trained healers she was creating throughout the region. Working with some of the more politically sophisticated members of her network, Margaret had begun developing arguments for the legal and practical necessity of her medical training program. She emphasized the isolation of mountain communities, the scarcity of conventional medical care, and the documented effectiveness of her methods in saving lives and improving health outcomes. More strategically, she had begun cultivating relationships with influential political figures who had either benefited from her medical services or who had family members who had been helped by her treatments. The political campaign had culminated in a formal petition to the state government, signed by hundreds of mountain families, requesting official recognition and protection for Margaret's medical practice and training program. The petition had documented specific cases where Margaret's interventions had saved lives, prevented disabilities, and solved medical problems that conventional medicine had been unable to address. It had also included testimonials from respected community leaders who vouched for Margaret's character and the value of her work. The response from state officials had been cautiously positive. Rather than moving immediately to shut down Margaret's operations, they had appointed a commission to investigate her methods and evaluate the claims being made about her effectiveness. The commission had included both conventional medical practitioners and government officials, and they had spent several weeks on Widow's Peak observing Margaret's work and interviewing patients and students. The commission's report had been remarkably favorable, acknowledging both the effectiveness of Margaret's treatments and the desperate need for medical services in the isolated mountain communities. The report had recommended that Margaret be granted special authorization to continue her medical practice and training program, subject to certain oversight, requirements, and periodic reviews of her methods and results. The official recognition had represented a complete transformation in Margaret's legal and social status. The woman who had been cast out as a burden and had been accused of practicing witchcraft was now officially recognized as a legitimate medical practitioner whose services were considered essential to the well-being of the mountain communities. But perhaps more important than official recognition was the growing network of trained healers who were carrying Margaret's knowledge back to their own communities. By the end of her second year on Widow's Peak, Margaret had trained over 50 people in the use of herbal medicine and traditional healing techniques. These practitioners were scattered throughout the mountain region, providing medical care that was both more accessible and more effective than anything that had been available before Margaret's arrival. The transformation was evident in the changing health statistics for the mountain communities. Infant mortality rates had dropped dramatically, deaths from infectious diseases had been reduced by more than half, and the incidence of chronic conditions had decreased significantly. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, the general health and vitality of the mountain population had improved noticeably as people gained access to preventive care and effective treatments for conditions that had previously been considered inevitable. Parts of mountain life. As Margaret approached the third anniversary of her arrival on Widow's Peak, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate exile to regional medical authority. The cabin that had once seemed like a tomb had become the center of a revolution that was transforming the lives of thousands of people scattered across hundreds of miles of mountain territory. That widow who had been cast out to die had instead found a way to save countless lives, and in doing so, she had discovered that sometimes the most powerful form of survival was learning how to help others survive as well. The autumn of 1895 brought with it a crisis that would test not only Margaret's medical expertise but also her ability to navigate the complex political and social forces that had begun to swirl around her growing influence in the mountain region. What started as a routine outbreak of influenza in several scattered communities quickly escalated into something far more serious, an epidemic that threatened to overwhelm the medical resources of the entire region and forced Margaret to make decisions that would define her legacy for generations to come. The first signs of trouble had appeared in late September, when Margaret's network of trained healers began reporting an unusually virulent strain of respiratory illness that was spreading rapidly through the mountain communities. Unlike the seasonal influenza that typically appeared each fall, this new illness seemed to affect healthy adults as severely as children and elderly people, and the mortality rate was alarmingly high even among patients who received prompt treatment using the standard remedies from the Garrett journals. Margaret's initial response had been to intensify the distribution of her most effective respiratory medicines, combinations of echinacea, elderberry, and pine needle extracts that had proven successful against previous influenza outbreaks. She had also issued detailed instructions for supportive care techniques, including steam treatments, chest poultices, and nutritional protocols designed to support the immune system during serious illness. But as reports continued to arrive from throughout the region, it became clear that the standard treatments were not sufficient to control this. A particular outbreak. The breakthrough and understanding came when Margaret received a detailed report from one of her most experienced apprentices, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Collins, who served several communities in the northern part of the region. Sarah had noticed that the illness seemed to follow a particular pattern. It was spreading most rapidly in communities that had recent contact with railroad workers and traveling merchants, and the symptoms were more severe than anything she had seen in her 5 years of practicing herbal medicine under Margaret's guidance. More importantly, Sarah had observed that patients who developed secondary pneumonia as a complication of the initial illness were dying at rates that approached 50%, despite receiving aggressive treatment with the most potent respiratory medicines in the Garrett collection. This mortality rate was far higher than anything Margaret had encountered before, and it suggested that they were dealing with a strain of influenza that was either unusually virulent or complicated by some additional factor that their standard treatments weren't addressing. Margaret's investigation into the unusual characteristics of the outbreak led her to consult some of the most advanced and esoteric sections of the Garrett journals, volumes that dealt with what the old healers had called the traveling sicknesses and the pestilences that follow commerce. These texts, written in an archaic style that was sometimes difficult to interpret, described epidemic diseases that seemed to be associated with increased contact between isolated communities and the outside world. According to these ancient sources, such epidemics required treatment approaches that went beyond addressing the immediate symptoms of the illness. The Garrett healers had apparently recognized that some diseases created what they called a poisoning of the vital essence that made patients vulnerable to secondary infections and complications that could be fatal even when the original illness was relatively mild. The treatment for such conditions involved not just herbal medicines but complex protocols designed to restore the natural harmony of the body's defensive forces. The protocols described in these advanced texts were unlike anything Margaret had attempted before. They involved precise combinations of dozens of different herbs, administered according to carefully timed schedules that seemed to be based on the phases of the moon and the patient's individual constitution. More challenging, the treatments required the preparation of medicines using techniques that were described in almost mystical language, involving processes of fermentation, distillation, and concentration that pushed the boundaries of what Margaret thought was possible using the equipment available on Widow's Peak. But as the death toll from the epidemic continued to mount by early October, nearly 200 people had died in communities throughout Margaret's network. She realized that she had no choice but to attempt the advanced treatment protocols, regardless of their complexity or the risk that they might not work. Working around the clock with her most experienced assistants, Margaret began preparing the medicines described in the ancient texts, following instructions that had been written down more than a century earlier by healers who had faced similar crises. The preparation process was exhausting and technically demanding. Some medicines required continuous stirring for days at a time, with different assistants taking shifts to ensure that the preparations were never left unattended. Others involved complex distillation procedures that had to be performed at specific temperatures and atmospheric conditions, requiring Margaret to develop new equipment and techniques based on cryptic descriptions in the old journals. Most challenging were the medicines that required what the texts called solar and lunar charging preparations that had to be exposed to sunlight and moonlight according to precise schedules, apparently to enhance their therapeutic properties through some mechanism that the Garrett healers understood but had not explained in terms that Margaret could easily interpret. These procedures seemed to border on the mystical, but Margaret's desperate situation left her willing to try anything that offered hope of controlling the epidemic. The first test of the advanced protocols came when Margaret applied them to treat a family of 7 in a community about 15 miles from Widow's Peak. All 7 members of the Thompson family had had contracted the virulent influenza, and 3 of them, including 2 young children, and the family's grandmother, had developed the secondary pneumonia that had proven fatal in so many other cases. Using conventional treatments, Margaret estimated that at least 3 of the family members would die, and the others would face a lengthy recovery with possible long-term complications. The advanced treatment protocol for the Thompson family involved administering a series of herbal medicines according to a precise schedule that took into account each patient's age, constitution, and stage of illness. The primary medicine was a concentrated extract that combined more than 30 different plants, prepared using fermentation techniques that enhanced the bioactive compounds, while creating synergistic effects between the different ingredients. This was supplemented with steam treatments using aromatic herbs, chest poultices that were changed every 4 hours according to specific formulations, and nutritional support using foods that the ancient texts claimed would strengthen the vital flame. The results were remarkable. Within 48 hours, all 7 family members showed significant improvement, with fever reduction, easier breathing, and increased alertness. Within a week, even the 3 family members who had developed secondary pneumonia were clearly recovering, with normal breathing and appetite returning. Within 2 weeks, the entire family had made what appeared to be a complete recovery, with no sign of the lingering weakness and complications that typically followed severe influenza. Word of the Thompson family's recovery spread quickly through Margaret's network, and soon she was receiving desperate requests from communities throughout the region for access to the advanced treatment protocols. But the complexity and resource requirements of the new medicines meant that Margaret couldn't simply distribute them widely as she had done with her standard herbal preparations. Each batch of the primary medicine required nearly a week to prepare and used rare herbs that weren't readily available in large quantities. The solution came from an unexpected source. Margaret's network of apprentices and trained healers volunteered to establish a coordinated production, the system that would allow the advanced medicines to be prepared simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the region. Working from detailed instructions that Margaret prepared based on the Garrett journals, teams of healers in different communities began preparing components of the complex medicines, which were then transported to central locations where Margaret or her most experienced assistants could complete the final preparation stages. This collaborative approach required unprecedented coordination and communication across the mountain regions, scattered communities. Margaret established a system of messengers who carried detailed instructions and progress reports between different preparation sites, ensuring that the various components of the medicines were ready at the same time and met the exacting quality standards required for the treatments to be effective. The epidemic response also required Margaret to make difficult decisions about resource allocation and treatment priorities. The advanced medicines were effective, but they required enormous amounts of time and materials to produce. Margaret had to determine which communities would receive priority for treatment, how to distribute limited quantities of medicine fairly, and how to train enough people in the complex administration protocols to ensure that the treatments were applied correctly. These decisions forced Margaret to confront the reality that her role had evolved far beyond that of a simple healer or even a medical teacher. She was now functioning as a public health administrator, coordinating medical responses across a region that encompassed hundreds of square miles and thousands of people. The choices she made about treatment protocols and resource allocation would determine who lived and who died, and the precedents she established would influence how future medical crises were handled throughout the mountain communities. The most controversial aspect of Margaret's epidemic response was her decision to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay or their social standing within their communities. Traditional medical practice typically gave priority treatment to wealthy and influential patients, leaving the poor to rely on charity or die without care. But Margaret's approach, influenced by the egalitarian philosophy she had found in the Garrett journals, emphasized treating the sickest patients first, regardless of their economic status. This policy brought Margaret into conflict with several prominent families who expected preferential treatment for their members, and it also created tensions with local political leaders who assumed that their authority entitled them to priority medical care. The conflicts escalated when Margaret refused to provide the advanced epidemic medicines to the family of a wealthy mine owner who had been one of her most vocal critics. Even though his children were among those affected by the outbreak, the mine owner, Cornelius Blackwood, had responded to Margaret's refusal by threatening legal action and attempting to mobilize political opposition to her medical practice. He had argued that Margaret's socialistic approach to medical care was dangerous to established social order and that her refusal to recognize proper social hierarchies proved that she was unfit to hold authority over life and death medical decisions. But Margaret's response to Blackwood's threats had demonstrated how completely her position in the mountain communities had changed since her arrival on Widow's Peak 4 years earlier. Rather than backing down in the face of opposition from a wealthy and powerful adversary, she had publicly defended her treatment policies and challenged Blackwood to explain why his family's wealth should entitle them them to medical care at the expense of poorer families whose need was greater. The confrontation had culminated in a public meeting where Margaret had presented detailed statistics showing the effectiveness of her epidemic response and the lives that had been saved. Through a coordinated treatment program, she had documented that the mortality rate from the influenza outbreak in communities using her advanced protocols was less than 5%, compared to mortality rates of 30 to 50% in areas that relied solely on conventional medical treatment. More importantly, Margaret had demonstrated that her egalitarian treatment policies had actually improved overall health outcomes by ensuring that the epidemic was controlled more quickly and effectively. By treating the sickest patients first, regardless of their social status, she had prevented the disease from spreading to levels where it would have overwhelmed all available medical resources and resulted in higher mortality rates even among wealthy families. The public vindication of Margaret's epidemic response had marked a definitive turning point in her relationship with the broader political and social establishment of the region. She was no longer seen as a tolerated eccentric or even a valuable but marginal medical practitioner. She had become a figure of genuine authority whose decisions affected the welfare of entire communities and whose methods had proven superior to conventional medical practice under the most demanding circumstances. By the time the epidemic finally subsided in late November, Margaret's network had successfully treated more than 3,000 patients using the advanced protocols derived from the Garrett journals. The mortality rate for patients receiving her treatments had been less than 3%, compared to rates exceeding 40% in areas that relied on conventional medical care. More importantly, patients treated using Margaret's methods had recovered more quickly and completely, with fewer long-term complications and disabilities. The success of the epidemic response had also demonstrated the effectiveness of the decentralized medical training, a system that Margaret had developed over the previous 3 years. Her network of apprentices and trained healers had proven capable of implementing complex treatment protocols under emergency conditions, maintaining quality standards, and coordinating their efforts across vast geographic distances without constant direct supervision. As winter approached and the immediate crisis passed, Margaret found herself reflecting on how far she and her network had come since those desperate early days on Widow's Peak. The widow who had been cast out to die in the mountains had become the architect of a medical system that served thousands of people across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain. The knowledge that had been hidden beneath the cabin floor for a century had been transformed into a living tradition that was saving lives and building communities throughout the mountain region. But Margaret also understood that the success of her epidemic response had created new challenges and responsibilities that would shape the next phase of her work. The demonstration of her network's capabilities had attracted attention from medical and political authorities far beyond the mountain region, and there were already indications that attempts would be made to either co-opt her methods or suppress them entirely. The widow's journey from exile to authority was far from over, and the greatest tests of her vision and determination still lay ahead. The spring of 1898 found Margaret Whitmore standing at a crossroads that would well have seemed impossible to imagine. During those desperate first days on Widow's Peak 6 years earlier, the woman who had been cast out as a burden had become the most influential medical practitioner in 3 states. Her network of trained healers now serving communities across hundreds of miles of Appalachian territory. But with success had come scrutiny from powerful interests who saw her growing influence as both an opportunity to exploit and a threat to contain. The latest challenge had arrived in the form of Dr. Harrison Pemberton, a representative of the newly formed American Medical Association who had traveled from Philadelphia specifically to investigate what his organization termed the irregular medical practices being conducted in the West Virginia mountain region. Unlike the local opposition Margaret had faced from Dr. Caldwell and other regional physicians, Dr. Pemberton represented the emerging movement to standardize and control medical practice throughout the entire country. Dr. Pemberton was a man of considerable education and political sophistication, armed with credentials from the most prestigious medical institutions in the East and backed by an organization that was rapidly gaining the power to determine who could legally practice medicine in the United States. His mission was straightforward: to evaluate Margaret's methods according to scientific medical standards and to recommend either their incorporation into mainstream medical practice or their suppression as dangerous quackery. Investigation had begun cordially enough, with Dr. Pemberton accepting Margaret's invitation to observe her methods and examine her results firsthand. For 2 weeks, he had accompanied Margaret on her rounds, observed treatments in the expanded medical complex on Widow's Peak, and interviewed patients who had been helped by her interventions. He had also spent considerable time examining the Garrett journals and watching Margaret's apprentices demonstrate the herbal preparation techniques that had become the foundation of their medical practice. Margaret had approached the investigation with cautious optimism, hoping that an objective evaluation by a qualified medical professional might finally provide the scientific validation that would protect her network from future challenges. She had been meticulous in documenting her methods and results, maintaining detailed case records that tracked patient outcomes over months and years. She had also prepared comprehensive explanations of the theoretical basis for her treatments, drawing on both the empirical observations recorded in the Garrett journals and her own growing understanding of how herbal medicines work. But Dr. Pemberton's preliminary assessment had been deeply troubling. While he acknowledged the apparent effectiveness of Margaret's treatments and the obvious health improvements in the communities served by her network, he had also expressed serious concerns about what he termed the unscientific basis of her methods and the dangerous precedent of allowing untrained individuals to practice medicine without proper supervision. Mrs. Whitmore, he had said during one of their final conversations, I don't question your good intentions or even the apparent success of some of your treatments, but medicine is advancing rapidly beyond the primitive empiricism that your methods represent. The future of healthcare lies in scientific understanding of disease processes, standardized treatment protocols, and systematic training that ensures consistent quality and safety. Margaret had listened to Dr. Pemberton's critique with growing understanding of the fundamental conflict they faced. This wasn't simply a disagreement about specific medical techniques. It was a collision between two completely different philosophies about how healing should be practiced and who should have authority over medical decisions. Dr. Pemberton represented a vision of medicine as a scientific profession controlled by credentialed experts and regulated by centralized authorities. Margaret's network embodied a different model based on community-centered care, empirical knowledge passed down through generations, and the principle that effective healing should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their economic status. The philosophical differences had become even more apparent during Dr. Pemberton's examination of the Garrett journals. While he had been impressed by the systematic observation and detailed documentation that the journals contained, he had also been troubled by what he saw as their unscientific approach to understanding how medicines worked. The Garrett healers had focused on documenting what treatments were effective under what circumstances, but they had not developed theories about the underlying biological mechanisms that made their treatment successful. These journals represent remarkable empirical observation, Dr. Pemberton had acknowledged, but they lacked the theoretical framework that would allow their insights to be integrated into modern medical understanding. Without scientific explanations for why these treatments work, we have no way to improve them, standardize them, or ensure that they can be safely applied in different contexts. Margaret's response had drawn on 6 years of experience using the Garrett methods and training others in their application. Dr. Pemberton, she had replied, I've seen these treatments save thousands of lives and cure conditions that conventional medicine considers hopeless. If the choice is between theoretical understanding and practical results, I'll take the results every time. The people in these mountains don't need to understand why willow bark reduces fever. They need to know that it works and how to prepare it safely. The debate had continued for hours, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of medical knowledge and the proper relationship between practitioners and patients. Dr. Pemberton had argued that scientific understanding was essential for medical progress and that allowing irregular practitioners to operate without proper training would ultimately harm more people than it helped. Margaret had countered that the scientific medical establishment had consistently failed to serve isolated and impoverished communities, and that her network provided effective care to people who would otherwise have no access to healing at all. But the real test of their competing philosophies had come when a medical emergency arose that challenged both conventional and traditional approaches. A logging accident had brought a severely injured man to Margaret's clinic, his leg crushed so badly that Dr. Pemberton immediately recommended amputation as the only way to save his life. The injury was complicated by massive blood loss, extensive tissue damage, and clear signs of developing infection that threatened to spread throughout the patient's system. Margaret's examination of the injured man, guided by surgical techniques described in the most advanced Garrett journals, had suggested a different approach. The old texts described procedures for saving severely damaged limbs using combinations of herbal antiseptics, tissue regeneration compounds, and surgical techniques that went far beyond anything taught in conventional medical schools. The procedures were risky and technically demanding, but they offered the possibility of saving the leg that Dr. Pemberton had written off as unsalvageable. A decision about how to treat the injury had forced both Margaret and Dr. Pemberton to confront the practical implications of their competing medical philosophies. Dr. Pemberton's recommendation for immediate amputation was based on established medical protocols that prioritized patient survival over preservation of function. Margaret's alternative approach was based on empirical knowledge derived from the Garrett journals, but it involved procedures that had no recognition in scientific medical literature and carried risks that couldn't be precisely quantified. After hours of discussion with the patient and his family, Margaret had been given permission to attempt the limb salvage procedure described in the Garrett journals. Working with her most experienced assistants while Dr. Pemberton observed, she had performed a complex operation that combined surgical debridement of damaged tissue with the application of herbal compounds designed to prevent infection and promote tissue regeneration. The procedure had taken more than 6 hours and had required Margaret to use every advanced technique she had learned from the Garrett texts. She had cleaned the wound using powerful herbal antiseptics, removed damaged bone and tissue with surgical precision, and applied poultices containing dozens of healing compounds in carefully orchestrated combinations. Most challengingly, she had used regenerative techniques that seemed to stimulate the growth of new blood vessels and nerve connections, procedures that the Garrett journals described but that conventional medicine considered impossible. The results had been extraordinary even by Margaret's standards. Despite the severity of the injury and the complexity of the procedure, the patient had recovered without developing the systemic infection that Dr. Pemberton had considered inevitable. More remarkably, the damaged leg had healed with nearly complete restoration of function. allowing the patient to return to work within 3 months of the accident. Dr. Pemberton's response to the successful surgery had been a mixture of professional fascination and institutional concern. He had been forced to acknowledge that Margaret had achieved results that contradicted everything he had been taught about the limits of surgical intervention. But he had also worried about the implications of accepting techniques that couldn't be explained or standardized according to scientific medical principles. "Mrs. Whitmore," he had said, "what you've accomplished here is remarkable, but it also illustrates exactly why irregular medical practices are dangerous. You've achieved an outcome that seems miraculous, but you can't explain how you did it. You can't guarantee that the same techniques will work in different cases, and you can't train other practitioners to replicate your results with confidence." Margaret's response had been informed by 6 years of teaching the Garrett methods to dozens of apprentices and seeing them achieve similar results in their own communities. "Dr. Pemberton," she had replied, "I've trained 53 people in these surgical techniques, and they've successfully performed similar procedures hundreds of times throughout this region. The methods can be taught, they can be replicated, and they work consistently when applied by people who understand the principles involved." The fundamental disagreement between Margaret and Dr. Pemberton had ultimately centered on the question of how medical knowledge that should be validated and disseminated. Dr. Pemberton believed that only treatments approved by scientific medical institutions should be considered legitimate, regardless of their effectiveness in practice. Margaret argued that any treatment that consistently saved lives and improved health should be considered valid, regardless of whether it fit within conventional medical theory. The resolution of this conflict had come through an unexpected source: political pressure from the mountain communities themselves. Word of Dr. Pemberton's investigation and his preliminary criticisms of Margaret's methods had spread throughout her network, generating a response that surprised both Margaret and her critic. Rather than passively accepting the judgment of medical authorities, the communities served by Margaret's that network had organized to defend her right to continue her practice. The defense had taken the form of a massive petition drive that collected more than 10,000 signatures from people who had been treated by Margaret or her apprentices. The petition had documented specific cases where Margaret's interventions had saved lives, cured chronic conditions, or provided relief from suffering that conventional medicine had been unable to address. More importantly, the petition had been accompanied by letters of support from political leaders, religious authorities, and business interests, who recognized the economic and social value of Margaret's medical network. The political mobilization had culminated in a formal hearing before the state legislature, where Margaret had been called upon to defend her methods and Dr. Pemberton had been invited to present his concerns. The hearing had attracted national attention, with newspaper reporters and medical professionals from throughout the country traveling to witness what many saw as a defining moment in the struggle between traditional and scientific approaches to medical care. Margaret's presentation to the legislature had been a masterpiece of practical argument and moral persuasion. She had documented the health improvements that her network had brought to previously underserved communities, presented statistical evidence of the effectiveness of her treatments, and challenged the legislators to explain why successful healing methods should be suppressed simply because they didn't conform to academic medical theories. More powerfully, she had brought with her a parade of patients whose lives had been saved or dramatically improved by treatments that conventional medicine had declared impossible. Children who had been cured of incurable wasting diseases stood healthy and strong before the legislature. Adults who had been told they would never walk again demonstrated full mobility and function. Families who had lost loved ones to epidemic diseases testified about how Margaret's interventions had saved their remaining members. Dr. Pemberton's presentation had focused on the potential dangers of allowing untrained practitioners to perform complex medical procedures and the importance of maintaining scientific standards in medical practice. But his abstract arguments about theoretical risks had seemed pale and unconvincing when contrasted with the concrete evidence of lives saved and health restored that Margaret had presented. The legislature's decision had been unanimous. Margaret's medical practice and training network would be granted official recognition and protection under state law, subject to periodic review but immune from prosecution for practicing medicine without conventional credentials. More importantly, the legislature had authorized the establishment of a formal medical school based on Margaret's methods, with state funding to support the training of healers who could serve rural and underserved communities throughout the region. The victory had represented more than just personal vindication for Margaret. It had established a precedent that would protect traditional healing methods and community-based medical practice from suppression by centralized medical authorities. The mountain healing network that had grown from the knowledge hidden beneath the cabin floor had become a model for medical care that prioritized accessibility, effectiveness, and community control over professional credentials and institutional authority. That is, Margaret stood on the porch of her expanded cabin complex, now officially designated as the Appalachian Institute of Traditional Medicine. She reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate exile to national recognition. The widow who had been cast out to die had become the founder of a medical movement that would influence healthcare practice for generations to come. Her children, now young adults with their own roles in the medical network, had grown up understanding that healing was both a science and an art, that knowledge was most valuable when it was shared, and that the greatest medical discoveries often came from listening carefully to the wisdom of the past while remaining open to the needs of the present. Samuel, now 24, had become a skilled surgeon and teacher, carrying carrying the Garrett surgical techniques to communities throughout the South. Elizabeth, 22, had established satellite medical schools in 3 different states, training new generations of healers who combined traditional knowledge with modern innovations. The younger children had all found their own paths within the network, contributing their unique talents to the ongoing work of healing and education. Most remarkably, baby Rose, now a vibrant 7-year-old who had no memory of the fever that had nearly claimed her life during those first desperate weeks on Widow's Peak, had begun showing the same intuitive understanding of plants and healing that had characterized the greatest practitioners in the Garrett tradition. Margaret often watched her youngest daughter examining herbs with the focused attention of a born healer and wondered what discoveries the next generation would make using the knowledge that had been saved from a century of silence. The cabin that no one had dared to touch for 100 years had become the foundation of a healing tradition that served thousands of people across multiple states. The cursed place that had been avoided by generations of mountain folk was now a destination for people seeking hope, health, and knowledge from throughout the country. And Margaret Whitmore, the widow who had been cast out with nothing but hunger and desperation, had discovered that sometimes the most powerful treasures are hidden in the places that everyone else is too afraid to explore. The knowledge that had saved her family's lives had become a legacy that would heal communities for generations to come, proving that exile can become inheritance, and that the most important discoveries often wait patiently in the darkness for someone brave enough to bring them into the light. The widow's journey from exile to authority had ended where it began, with a mother's determination to save her children and a willingness to look for answers in the most unlikely places. But what had begun as desperate survival had become something far greater, a testament to the power of knowledge, the strength of community, and the extraordinary things that can happen when people refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable.